So, welcome again to the 2022 Conference of the Research Community at the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology here in Cambridge. And it gives me great pleasure to present our keynote speaker, Dr. Beth Phillips, Elizabeth, who recently joined the Wolf Institute as Public Engagement Officer with oversight of the Institute's outreach and public education programs. And she continues to teach political theology in the Cambridge Theological Federation. Beth has worked in the Federation since 2009 and was previously lecturer in Christian ethics and director of studies at Westcott House and 2020 research fellow at the Margaret Beaufort Institute. During her research fellowship, she completed the Flourishing Inside project, which she's going to speak to this morning about resourcing those working in chaplaincy and pastoral care in prison. She is the author of Political Theology, A Guide for the Perplexed, continuing 2012, co-editor of the T&T Clark Reader in Political Theology, also T&T Clark 2021, and the Cambridge Companion to Political Theology, Cambridge University Press 2015. Thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you.
So do you want to go straight to the PowerPoint?
Sure, yes, thank you.
So I'm just going to be sharing my screen now.
So if anyone online has any trouble hearing me at any point, do just let Dominic know and he can tell me to speak up. So first of all, thank you to Dominic for the opportunity to share this research with you all today. And I should say thanks also to Anna Abram and the Institute for appointing me as the 2020 fellow, which gave me the opportunity to do this research, and especially to Ferdia Stone Davis, who had oversight as the director of research and supported me very closely as we all needed much mutual support during 2020. And then, of course, to the Plater Trust, who funded this project very generously and made it possible. So what I'm going to do today is just introduce the shape of the project, some of the key themes and findings that arose from it, and then say a little bit about the specific outputs, because the aims of the project were specifically about creating resources for people who do pastoral care in prisons, as well as creating something that could contribute to scholarly conversations about that work. So if we could move to the slide. The first thing I should say is that I can't take credit for the initial idea for this project. Before I came on as a research fellow, there had been a previous draft of a proposal to do the project just relating Catholic social teaching to prison chaplaincy. So there was already a kind of working draft in place. What I contributed coming into the project was I'd been working, co-convening a course in a prison for 3 years and doing an ethnographic study of that experience. And so coming from that work in the previous 3 years, I was really interested in making this more of a multifaceted and multi-directional conversation that wasn't just what can Catholic social teaching say to prison ministry, but also what do we need to hear from prisons that people who work in prisons need to hear, but also maybe that needs to be fed back into Catholic social thought. And so that's kind of where I added in something that became the final proposal for the project. So are we able to move to the next slide? There we go. So you'll see here what our research questions are. We wanted to know what people in prisons need from the people who do pastoral work there. And I use the phrase pastoral work rather than always saying chaplaincy, because some people who are doing this work in prisons don't have the title chaplain, but may work with the chaplaincy team or have other various pastoral roles. What resources do these pastoral workers need? How can they work best within the prison system? What can Catholic social thought contribute? And how can Catholic social thought be enhanced from listening to the prison context? So the way that we tried to get at answering these research questions was by sort of triangulating 3 areas of research. One was analyzing the literature related to prison chaplaincy. One was listening to participants in the project who included current practitioners in prison pastoral care and former prison residents. And then also an analysis of Catholic social thought as it relates to this work. Now, the initial shaping of the project and the method for the project was intended to be, a completely collaborative, participative action research project. We had our first sort of action research event on March 9th, 2020, which if you think back, you'll quickly realize that we had our first event and then swiftly found out we would be having no further events. I did as much as I could do by way of some interviews after that instead of the events that we were planning to have. But especially at the beginning of the pandemic, trying to get in touch with a vulnerable population, people who used to be in prison, and people who work with vulnerable populations, you know, none of those people had time to do optional things like research interviews in 2020. So we did have to shift the methodology of the project a lot and make it much more focused on the textual research and you know, sort of triangulating that with a much smaller participant input, whereas we had planned it to be entirely an action research project. Okay, the next slide, please. So I'm sure you can't read all of this, and that's fine because I'm going to unpack each of these, but just to let you see on the website, which I'll show you at the end, and I hope that you'll all take some time to look at later, you can see this graphic, and it's also in the report, which you can access from the website, that shows the 3 areas of research and then sort of what we found out. The key findings are there in the middle with the intersections of those 3 areas. But that's what I'm going to be unpacking now. And I should say this lovely graphic, Ferdia herself did in the end after a bizarre process that we had with the designer that we had hired that we thought was going to be doing all of our design work. So Ferdia gets the credit for the visuals. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll start unpacking each of these areas briefly. So first of all, looking at the literature that has to do with prison ministry, I came at this from several different directions. So spent a lot of time in several different areas of literature. This included empirical studies of prison chaplaincy, empirical studies of prisons which address chaplaincy. Most of those actually have to do with religion more broadly rather than chaplaincy in particular. Theological work about chaplaincy in general, not just prison chaplaincy, but what it means to be a chaplain, what the work of chaplaincy is. And then the theological work that's specifically about prison chaplaincy, theological work which relates Catholic social teaching or Catholic social thought more broadly to prisons, and documents published by Catholic bishops in the US and in England and Wales regarding prisons. So these are the different areas of textual research that I was looking at, because the unfortunate shift away from action research did mean that there was the opportunity for a much broader textual research as well. In terms of empirical studies of prison chaplaincy, there are very few. Basically, there are 2 main studies in the US and 2 main studies in the UK that I was able to look at. One of them by Andrew Todd, who's in the Cambridge Theological Federation. Most of the relevant literature in criminology, people who do prisons research, is more broadly about religion in prisons rather than looking at the work of chaplains or chaplaincy in particular, but there's still a lot of relevant findings there. There's very little theological work specifically on prison chaplaincy, so a lot of that work is about chaplaincy in general. And then in terms of the documents published by Catholic bishops, the main ones are in England and Wales, a document called A Place of Redemption, a Christian approach to punishment in prison. And then in the US Catholic bishops, Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration is their main document. Okay, if we can move to the next. So some of the key themes that arose from looking at this literature include the following. The first is that there are significant tensions between theologies and theories of what the role of a prison chaplain should be and the realities of what the role is, or how people around prison chaplains perceive the role. So this includes things like chaplains saying that what they believe is most important about what they do and what they have to spend most of their time doing are 2 different things. There are findings that show that chaplains themselves understand their role as religious, whereas residents in prison and staff in prison tend to think of their role in more humanitarian terms. This includes also several different studies relating to extremism. And if you sort of bring those together, a picture develops in which prison chaplains are saying that they believe that extremism is very rare within prisons, but that the job of prison chaplaincy has been very changed in recent years because of anti-extremism requirements. And there's a group of criminologists who did 2 really well-known ethnographies of a high security prison in England. And one of their findings was that the governance of prison focuses on religion in prison as a risk area. When they think about religion in prison, they're always thinking about the risk of extremism. And there isn't a governance focus on the possible benefits of religion in prison, the possible benefits for people of faith practices. The next is that there are significant tensions for prison chaplains between working for and within the system and being a critical truth teller to the system. And in some ways, this is a common theme throughout all chaplaincy, that most chaplains have some level of tension between they work for some kind of institution, but are also supposed to be kind of an advocate of users or employees of that institution, and therefore have some sort of a critical responsibility as well, and holding that intention. But of course, that's particularly acute in something like prison chaplaincy. So this includes things like prison chaplains themselves understand themselves as working for and on behalf of those who are resident in prisons, but empirical research of prison chaplaincy shows that actually more than their self-understanding would indicate, they work on behalf of the interests of the prison system, including the control of those who are in the prisons. There are several pieces of theological work that notes that chaplains should and do act as critical friends, or as critics, or as a prophetic presence, or as a challenging presence within a difficult system. But almost all of that work mentions that, as opposed to actually unpacking that or giving people who work in prisons resources for understanding or developing that aspect of the role. And particularly noticeable was that in all of the training materials that I was able to look at for prison chaplains in this country, including that from the system, from the Church of England, from the Catholic Church, from the Quakers, none of those training materials that I saw addressed this aspect of the role at all, the sort of more critical or prophetic side of the role. I found 5 theological pieces basically that really focused on the idea that of a more critical or prophetic presence of the prison chaplain. And one of the really good pieces that a lot of people keep turning to is a very short thing that Rowan Williams did in 2003 called Ministry in Prison, Theological Reflections. And you can find that lots of places online now because so many people have returned to it. Another idea is that bringing in volunteers and other aspects of acting as a bridge between inside and outside of prison is central to the literature on the role and work of prison chaplaincy. And this includes things about what's important about bringing volunteers in, both for what that does for the volunteers themselves, as well as what that does for the work that they're able to do with and for those who are resident in prisons. And especially the idea that that those relationships enrich the church, that it's not only a one-way service to people in prison, but that's actually a beneficial and enriching relationship for the churches that are involved. The idea that chaplains and volunteers can also influence public perception and therefore possibly also policy related to prisons because of actually having exposure to being inside and meeting people who are resident in prison, which of course most people will never have the opportunity to do. This also includes recognizing that prison residents are members of society, which is often overlooked and forgotten, and there aren't ways of enacting that, but building those bridges and bringing in volunteers can sort of strengthen and develop that participation. And also that it can create ways that allow people who are currently resident in prison to continue to make positive contributions to society or to churches or both. And then, of course, this also has to do with the very important work of helping with transitions into and out of prison, and the very important bridging work that involves. Next is that in both the secular and theological work, there's a shared emphasis on the importance of the prisoner as person, including humanizing residents in dehumanizing contexts, recognizing each individual's personhood, upholding human dignity, and the creation of every human in the image of God. And this comes up in lots of ways, even in the sort of more criminological and empirical research. So for instance, a lot of the empirical research shows that people resident in prison understand and experience prison chaplains to be different from all the rest of the prison staff. And one of the main ways that they describe the way they're different is that they treat us like humans. They treat us like fellow human beings. And they see us as people, not just offenders. The humanizing effects of religious conversion in prison have been studied widely as well. So that's part of that theme. And then, of course, there's lots of theological work that emphasizes human beings as God's creation and therefore the intrinsic worth of every human being, and how that makes it really important for prison ministry to humanize or rehumanize people in this what can be a very dehumanizing system. Next, prison chaplains were described as those with a special responsibility to pay attention to power and justice and vulnerability. So this has to do also with that sort of critical truth-telling or prophetic role. And this, did I skip the, oh, I skipped the bit about theological work emphasizing the theme of presence, which is often related to incarnation. So a lot of the theological work on presence, on chaplaincy in general, talks about chaplaincy as a ministry of presence, of being there. And in the theological work, this is very often related to incarnation. And sometimes that's related to the idea of chaplains embodying the presence of Christ in prisons, but it also has to do with Christ incarnate in prisoners and encountering Christ there. In terms of attention to power and justice and vulnerability, these themes were especially prominent in the theological literature, and especially in those few sources where that critical role was being explored. So this has to do with calls to prison chaplains and the churches they're involved in to challenge institutional racism in the prison system, abuses of power, to stand on the side of the powerless, and to advocate for better policies in criminal justice. And finally, prison chaplains are also described as being responsible for and/or known in practice for their contribution to work which can be described in relation to redemption, restoration, or rehabilitation. And it should be said that there is not in the empirical literature a sort of clear, demonstrable link between religion in prison and reducing reoffending or reintegrating into society after prison. That link has not been demonstrated clearly. There are some small studies that demonstrate it and other studies that don't. What is clearly demonstrated is the role of religion in prison in helping people's experience inside prison. Research about prison chaplains shows that they tend to favor understandings of prison as rehabilitative instead of punitive. And theological work often emphasizes that prison ministry, which is redemptive, also advocates for restorative justice in terms of the criminal justice system, rather than retributive and retaliatory understandings of criminal justice. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So in terms of listening to participants to get some voices from inside prisons into this conversation in our project in particular, what we did was we had the practitioners event in March. And again, this was supposed to be the first of multiple events. This was 8 women who work in prison pastoral work. And we had a 5-hour, basically a focus group kind of event. And then I did interviews with 6 former prison residents. I was just starting these in person. And then of course, everything in person had to stop. And I was only able to get a few done on the phone, or it just became impossible to reach anyone in both of these sort of populations. All the conversations were recorded, transcribed, and coded with permission, and that's how they were sort of brought in and triangulated with the other areas of research. So of course, there's no way in which these are representative samples. This information can't be used in that way, but that's fine because the intention was to bring some voices into the conversation, not to demonstrate empirical results about either prison chaplains or former prison residents. So if we can look at the next slide. So on the day that we had the research event, the way we did the day, the method was influenced a little bit by a method called participative narrative inquiry, in which in some larger scale research projects, they asked the participants to tell their story about whatever the research subject is. For instance, hospitals use this to do research about patient experience. They asked participants to tell their story, and then participants share their stories with one another, and the participants themselves identify what are the themes that are recurring in those stories. And so learning from that, the way we did this is we asked the practitioners a series of questions, and they would write short responses on these yellow notes, and we would put those up and discuss them together, and then we kind of together moved them around into these clusters and named the clusters. So it was the participants themselves helping us identify what are the themes here, what's emerging here, what's most important. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll see what some of those were. One of the things that came up a lot was bereavement care. And this was really interesting because this was not nearly as prominent in any of the literature as it was in talking to both the practitioners and the former prison residents. That because one of the statutory duties of prison chaplains is to visit someone when they've had a bereavement. And the experiences of people in prison, of how important that was to them and how meaningful that was to them really stood out, but also how practitioners reflect on what an important part of their work that is. There was also the theme of time and presence. And again, this is one of the ways that prison residents, both those in the empirical research and the former residents that I spoke with, that's one of the main ways they understand prison chaplains as being different from the rest of the prison staff, is these are the people who have time and take time to listen, to pay attention. These are the people whose presence feels different. It feels non-judgmental. And that's really a big theme in both the empirical research and in the conversations that we had. And that aspect of connections and bridges to the outside was a really big theme in our participants' conversations. So the former prison residents named having those connections with people from the outside as something they most appreciated about the chaplain's work. And they talked about how much assistance chaplains gave them in contacting relatives when they needed to, or making the transition upon release. Some of them even talked about some chaplains who stayed in contact with them after release and helped them through that transition. And here's where the role of community chaplaincy. So chaplains who are in the community who help people after release. That's where that became really prominent. And this is also clear in the empirical literature that people who are connected to community chaplaincies by the chaplains that they encounter inside prison, if they help connect them to a community chaplain, the chances of reintegration and not reoffending and better well-being greatly increase. And I spoke to one man who had been in prison 3 times, and the first 2 times he had never been put in contact with a community chaplain, and his life just fell apart and he couldn't really see any way forward except to return to his previous way of life. But the 3rd time he was connected to a community chaplaincy, and that really set him on a different path. And I think we've probably said enough about the sort of non-judgmental recognition of personhood, but just to say that was really strong in the conversations with all the participants as well. So if I could have the next slide, I've got a quote to kind of give an example. One practitioner said, and this has to do with especially the kind of presence and incarnation themes. One practitioner said, "We hope that we represent the image of Christ to people, but also we encounter Christ in them, so that So that transaction is what's central to what motivates me. The more I recognize Christ within the other, I realize how much it's lacking in me. And that also speaks to the sort of reciprocity of the recognition of the personhood of prison residents that is so prominent in both the research and the conversations about the humanizing presence of prison chaplains. Okay, next slide. So if we look at the previous slide was kind of the overlap of things that were common themes between the practitioners and the former residents, but there's some interesting things if we look at those groups individually as well. So for instance, the practitioners really emphasize sacramental and spiritual practice in terms of describing their work, in terms of describing what's important about their work, in terms of describing what they wanted more help with. But the prison residents, former prison residents, spoke much more about this tangible assistance that they received from chaplains and their advocacy on their behalf within the system. They spoke of that much more prominently than they did of the sacramental and spiritual practice. Former prison residents emphasized the physical space of the chapel or wherever the chaplaincy met as being really important to their experience and their well-being, as a place of peace, a place of solace, a place of fellowship, and a place of belonging. The practitioners emphasize the positives of working on chaplaincy teams when they talked about what was working well in their job and what they really enjoyed and where they felt well resourced. They talked about their chaplaincy teams. When they talked about what frustrates them, what inhibits them, what's difficult, it was about structural prison issues. The practitioners spoke a lot about lack in their work, about lacking the time they need, about lacking the resources they need, lacking the training they need, lacking the support and proper management systems that they need. They also emphasized their concern for prison residents, and this has to do with concerns about whether they are being mistreated, about overly harsh treatment, about various kinds of injustice, various kinds of structural problems that
people can talk about practical things
that are making life more difficult for prison residents. Therefore, it was somewhat interesting to me that when practitioners described what their problems were, what they were frustrated about, what they needed, it was very clearly about structural, systemic realities in the prisons. But then when they were asked specifically, what resources do you need? What could helpfully be provided for you? The answers were almost entirely liturgical resources or spiritual resources. And so even though there wasn't a spoken need for tools for critical social analysis, that really spoke to me of the importance of the project for connecting Catholic social thought to prison chaplaincy, because obviously to address the kinds of structural systemic realities that they're grappling with the most, they need tools for social analysis and for positive social transformation that are available in Catholic social thought, but there's not even an awareness of that possible connection. Okay, if we could have the next slide. So I have one quote that has to do with that, the chapel being a space of belonging. A participant played the piano in a chapel service and told of a fellow resident coming over to where he was sitting. He'd been forced to sit apart from the group because of the nature of his offense. And another fellow prison resident came over and thanked him for playing the piano, but a prison officer stopped him and said, "You do know he's a sex offender, don't you?" To which the resident replied, "Yeah, and continued to speak to him. And remembering this moment, the participant said, "It was the moment I realized the prison hierarchy and the stigmatization and all the rest of it is as entrenched by staff as it is by the majority of the prisoners. But actually, in that scenario, in chapel, Christianity overrode all of that. And for an hour or whatever a week, that division, despite being visible there because of being divided by the prison officers and sitting somewhere else, was overcome and it didn't matter." And the next slide. And then one of the practitioner participants, who was relatively new to working in prisons, said, "It has such a Kafkaesque feeling about it as soon as you walk through the door. Now my worry is, and this is not a criticism, if you get to working in that system for long, do you not begin to adjust to it? And the Kafkaesque nature of it just," and another participant finished the sentence, "becomes normal." So that's kind of representative of the sort of overarching structural issues and questions. Okay, next slide. So some of the key intersections with the research literature include that emphasis on chapel as a physical space of safety is also in the empirical literature. A really interesting thing that intersected with a couple of empirical studies was that the participants we spoke to sort of grumbled a lot about their perception that other groups, particularly Muslim groups, received better religious provision inside the prison. There have been empirical studies that show that all religious groups and chaplains feel that the other religious groups get better provision. Yes, I won't venture conclusions about that, but that's an interesting intersection. Another thing to note is that in the empirical literature, there's a real problem with the vast majority of the research only containing male research subjects, whether that's only male chaplains or overwhelmingly dominated by male chaplains or only male prison residents or former residents. So in our case, the practitioners we spoke to were all women, but the former prison residents I spoke to were all men. That has to do with the fact that there are fewer women in prisons than men, and also in terms of research, it's a much harder population to get in touch with because of all of the multiple layers of vulnerability that are often a part of that. But that's just to say there's so much that needs to be done about women in prisons that's not yet done, that became clear bringing those two things together. Okay, next slide. So then the third area of research, of course, has to do with Catholic social thought. So this includes the actual Catholic social teaching documents, as well as looking at introductions to and analyses of Catholic social teaching, and then online resources for Catholic social teaching and learning. And if we can go to the next slide. Again, Ferdia herself did this graphic for me after I did a very crude pencil sketch of what I was trying to get at. When you look at Catholic social teaching and people who write about Catholic social teaching or Catholic social thought, there's kind of a common list of what the key themes are, although they differ. This was where I settled on what the key themes of Catholic social thought are. And these are, you'll find these depicted in various ways. Sometimes they're depicted as sort of columns of a building or branches of a tree. But I was really persuaded that they needed to be depicted in a way that's very much more web-like, that shows the interconnections between them and sort of what the overarching convictions are around. And then the kind of four really key themes of peace, justice, human dignity, and the common good. And then these sub-themes that often exist somewhat in tension with each other, like subsidiarity and solidarity, kind of have a positive tension with one another, because one's slightly more about the common good and the other slightly more about individual human dignity. And that's kind of how it is on the two sides. If you want to look on the website, you'll find this graphic, and when you roll over each of the themes, then a paragraph comes up. It's either a paragraph from Catholic social teaching or from an introduction to Catholic social teaching that describes what each of these themes are. So that's also there that's one of the resources developed as part of the project. Okay, if we can go to the next one. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but just to say also on the full report, which you can find on the website, I go through all of the CST themes and how this relates to our participant research and how it relates to the literature research. And if you can go to the next slide to boil that down to something much more legible. Basically, the 4 core intersections of a Catholic social thought and prison chaplaincy that arose from all of this are that the recognition of the dignity of each person is central to prison chaplaincy, that by creating bridges between those inside and outside prisons, chaplains can contribute to the common good, participation in society, and connection with family and community. That through exercising critical presence, prison chaplains can seek justice and demonstrate the preferential option for those on the margins. And that as those within the system who are able to take time and pay attention, prison chaplains can cultivate peace, solidarity, and community. So our last slide, well, next to the last slide, is the project outputs. So as I said at the beginning, the main aims of this were to create things to contribute. And so what has arisen from this is we designed an MA module in Catholic social thought, which will now be available on the Anglia MAs that are taught in the Federation, which includes one on pastoral care and chaplaincy. So some people who are training to be chaplains will have access to that, but equally people who are studying Christian history and theology and ethics will have access to that module as well. I designed a series of short courses based on, given what the practitioners said they needed, given what the former prison residents reflected on, and what we found in the literature. I designed short courses on being a critical presence in prison chaplaincy, chaplaincy's inside and out, which is about those connections and bridging, and especially connecting to the community chaplains, and the importance of bereavement care in prisons and some extra training for bereavement care. We also hope to host some away days here at Margaret Beaufort, because one of the interesting things about gathering the practitioners was, even though it was a research day where we were listening to and learning from them, they were just so appreciative of a day to come here and be together that it became clear that that's one of the best resources we could offer them. It's just a day a year where they can come here and be together and reflect and share. We're also working on a book. This is an interdisciplinary international group of scholars and practitioners who are giving us chapters about Catholic social thought and prison ministry. So we've got some chaplains, some criminologists, some theologians, and together we're putting together a book which will be published next year by Routledge. And then we have the website where anybody can see the full project report, but also where there's resources for prison chaplains and others to learn more about Catholic social thought, Catholic social teaching, and how that relates to prison ministry. So do take a look at the website. If you just look up Flourishing Inside, you'll find it, or you can go to it from the Margaret Beaufort website in the research section. And I hope we have some time left for some questions. Thank you.
Beth, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Beth. And it's a wonderful project, and it's so much of what we are about at Margaret Beaufort. We have a strong pastoral focus with a really strong theological underpinning, a very mutual listening going on. So thank you so much for that. Oh, there's a message coming in from Julian. So Julian is just saying, thank you, Beth, for an interesting and insightful presentation. And he's sure that the hopes that the event is a success. I think he has to dash out. It's your colleague, isn't it? So thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure people have some questions and thoughts for Beth. I think I'll pause the recording there because in our seminars we normally don't record the discussion,
absolutely.
just so that people feel completely free.
Yeah.
So as I say, I will stop the recording there.